It all began with the kind of moment no one ever forgets, the kind of moment that changes everything. Picture this, a blazing hot summer afternoon, the kind of day where the heat seems to ripple off the streets and the air feels heavy. 12-year-old Marcus was pedaling his old rusty bike through the rich part of town, his shirt sticking to his back from the sweat. He didn't belong there, at least not according to the people who lived behind those iron gates and towering hedges. But Marcus liked riding through those streets. To him, the giant mansions with their marble columns and sparkling fountains looked like something out of a fairy tale. A world so different from the small apartment he shared with his mom and little sister. It was his way of dreaming, of peeking into a life he could only imagine. But that day, his simple bike ride turned into something far more terrifying, something that would put his courage to the ultimate test. As Marcus rounded a curve, he heard the screech of tires. His head snapped up and his heart skipped a beat. Just a few yards ahead, a sleek black limousine was swerving out of control, its tires squealing against the pavement. It was moving too fast, almost as if the driver had lost control completely. In a split second, the massive car skidded, hopped the curb, and slammed into a tree with a thunderous crash that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. The sound was so violent it made Marcus freeze in place, his hands clenching the handlebars of his bike. Thick gray smoke began pouring out from under the hood, curling into the sky. The driver's door burst open and a man stumbled out, clutching his arm, blood dripping down from a cut on his forehead. He was hurt, but what caught Marcus's eyes was the figure slumped in the back seat of the limousine. Through the cracked window, Marcus saw him, an older man in an expensive suit, his face pale, his body barely moving. The man was trapped. The air smelled sharp and metallic, and the hiss of the engine made Marcus's stomach twist. He knew enough from movies to realize the car could explode at any moment. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to run, to get away from the danger. After all, he was just a kid. What could he possibly do? But at the same time, something stronger pulled at him. His conscience, his heart, his sense of right and wrong. He thought of his mother's words she repeated every time life seemed unfair. You can't control what others do, but you can control who you are. Always do what's right. And with that thought, Marcus threw his bike to the ground and ran toward the wreck. He could feel the heat radiating from the car as he reached for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, his hands slipping from the sweat and the grime, but it stayed stuck. Panic rose in his chest, but he forced himself to keep going. He sprinted to the other side, coughing from the smoke that stung his eyes and burned his throat. This time, the door creaked open with a groan. Inside was the man who would soon change Marcus's life in ways he couldn't have imagined. Howard Kingston, the billionaire everyone in the city knew by name. He was a man of unimaginable wealth, a man who controlled companies, politicians, and even the headlines. His face had been on the news countless times, his name whispered in awe and fear. But behind the glamorous stories was an ugly truth. Howard Kingston had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. He was known for being ruthless in business and cruel in his personal beliefs. He was a man who openly expressed racist views, who never missed a chance to make comments that cut deep into the black community. To Marcus and people like him, Howard Kingston was the symbol of everything unfair in the world. And yet, here he was, vulnerable, broken, and in desperate need of help. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, even in that terrifying moment. The man who had spent his life looking down on people like him was now seconds away from death. And the only person standing between him and the flames was a black boy from the wrong side of town. Marcus didn't think about any of that for long, though. He just knew the man inside needed saving. He leaned in, grabbed Howard by the arm, and shook him. "Sir, you need to get out. The car's gonna blow." But Howard was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side, groaning weakly. For a heartbeat, Marcus thought about running for help, about screaming for the neighbors to call 911. But he knew it was already too late for waiting. The car gave a terrifying crack, and a burst of sparks flew from the engine. The smell of gasoline filled the air. Marcus realized it was now or never. With a deep breath, he pulled with every ounce of strength his small body could muster. Howard Kingston, the billionaire, the man Marcus had only seen on television, was heavy, far heavier than Marcus expected. His expensive suit jacket snagged on the seat, his shoes dragging against the ground. Marcus's arms ached and his legs shook, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch, he dragged the man out of the back seat, across the grass and away from the smoking wreck. When he finally collapsed beside him, gasping for air, Marcus dared to look back. The limousine made a sickening pop, followed by a fiery explosion that lit up the sky. Flames roared where the car had been only seconds earlier. Marcus had done it. He had saved the man's life. But little did he know, this was only the beginning of a story that would shock the world. Marcus's chest heaved as he crouched beside the unconscious man, his heart pounding like a drum inside his ears. The smell of burning gasoline filled the air, stinging his nose. He wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his hand, then shook Howard Kingston again, this time harder. "Wake up, you gotta move," he shouted, his young voice cracking with desperation. But Howard only groaned weakly, his eyelids fluttering like he was halfway between this world and the next. Marcus could hear the engine groaning in protest, sparks spitting under the hood, and every crackle of fire made him fear the worst. The limousine wasn't just smoking, it was threatening to become a fireball. Somewhere behind him, the injured driver stumbled further away, fumbling with his phone to call 911, but Marcus knew emergency crews wouldn't arrive in time. If he didn't act now, there wouldn't be anything left to save. His hands trembled, but he didn't let fear take over. He grabbed Howard by the arm and pulled with every ounce of strength he had. It felt impossible at first. Howard was a large man, his body limp and heavy like dead weight. Marcus's small fingers dug into the fabric of the billionaire's expensive suit jacket, tugging so hard the seams began to rip. His knees pressed into the dirt, his sneakers slipping on the grass as he tried to drag him further. Sweat poured down Marcus's face, mixing with the ash and smoke in the air, making his skin burn. Come on," he muttered to himself, gritting his teeth. He wasn't just pulling a body, he was pulling against fear itself, pulling against the voice in his head that whispered, "You can't do this. You're just a kid." But step by step, inch by inch, he made progress. He hooked his arms under Howard's shoulders and leaned back with all his weight, dragging the man's body across the lawn. His little muscles screamed in pain, but adrenaline kept him going. Howard's polished leather shoes dug into the dirt, making it even harder to move him. Marcus had to stop for a second, gasping, his arms burning. But when he looked back at the car, the sight of flames licking higher into the sky gave him the strength to keep pulling. The sound of metal snapping made Marcus freeze. For a horrifying moment, he thought the car might already be exploding. The hood burst open with a clang, flames leaping higher, and Marcus knew he couldn't stop now. He pushed himself past the limits of exhaustion, dragging Howard another 10 feet, then another. Finally, when his arms felt like they were going to give out, Marcus collapsed onto the grass. He turned his head just in time to see the limousine erupt into a fiery explosion, the force shaking the ground beneath him. The flames roared like a monster, black smoke billowing into the sky, the kind of sight Marcus had only seen in action movies. He lay there on his back, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his temples, his arms trembling so hard he could barely lift them. His heart raced not just from fear, but from the realization of what he had done. He had just saved someone's life. Not just anyone's life. A man whose face was plastered across newspapers and TV screens. A man whose name carried weight in every corner of the city. The driver, pale and wide-eyed, staggered over, staring at Marcus like he was seeing something unbelievable. "Kid," he said, his voice shaky, you just saved him. You just saved Mr. Kingston's life." The words hit Marcus like a wave. Howard Kingston. He'd heard the name 1,000 times before, usually spoken with equal parts respect and bitterness. Everyone knew Howard was one of the richest men in the state, maybe even the country. But just as famous as his money was his reputation. Marcus remembered overhearing adults in his neighborhood talk about him, saying he was heartless, arrogant, and cruel. He remembered hearing stories about how Howard had insulted black workers in his companies, refused to invest in diverse communities, and even mocked civil rights initiatives. He was the kind of man people like Marcus weren't supposed to like. The kind of man who made it clear that kids from Marcus's side of town didn't matter, and yet, here he was. The man who seemed untouchable no more. lying in the grass, bloody and unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. Marcus stared at him, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. He didn't understand why the universe had put him in this position. Why was he, of all people, the one standing between Howard Kingston and death? His mind raced with questions he didn't have time to answer. All he knew was that in this moment none of that mattered. The man needed help, and Marcus had chosen to help. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, echoing through the empty neighborhood streets. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as the sound of speeding engines filled the air. The paramedics were almost there. Marcus leaned back on his elbows, his small body shaking with exhaustion, and glanced at Howard's face again. The billionaire's chest rose and fell weakly. He was alive, but barely. As the ambulance pulled up, screeching to a stop, paramedics leapt out, rushing over with stretchers and medical bags. They swarmed around Howard, lifting him carefully, strapping oxygen over his face, shouting quick instructions to one another. Another paramedic crouched down to Marcus, checking him over. "Are you okay, kid? Did you get burned?" Marcus shook his head slowly, his throat too dry to answer. His eyes never left Howard as they carried him into the ambulance. Marcus didn't know it yet, but in saving that man's life, he had just set off a chain of events that would turn his world upside down. Howard Kingston woke up to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room, the steady beeping of machines echoing softly around him. For a few seconds, he didn't know where he was. His head throbbed, his body ached, and there was a strange taste of smoke lingering in his mouth. Slowly, flashes of memory returned. The crash, the heat, the smoke, the terror of being trapped. And then the face. A boy's face, dark-skinned, eyes filled with determination, pulling him out of danger when no one else could. Howard blinked rapidly, trying to steady his thoughts. The nurse who noticed him stirring rushed over, calling for the doctor. But before anyone could say anything, the first words out of Howard's mouth were not about his injuries or the accident. His voice rasped with weakness but carried urgency. "Where's the boy? The one who saved me?" The staff exchanged surprised glances. One of the assistants leaned closer and replied softly, "He's safe. He's in the lobby with his mother. He wouldn't leave until he knew you were alive." Howard closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. Something inside him cracked open, something he didn't quite understand yet. For years he had built walls around himself, walls of arrogance and prejudice. He prided himself on being untouchable, powerful, above the people he judged so harshly. And yet the wall had come crumbling down in a matter of minutes, torn apart not by wealth or power, but by the bravery of a 12-year-old black boy he had never even met. "Bring him in," Howard whispered, his voice trembling. "I want to see him." Minutes later, the door opened and Marcus stepped in, clutching his mother's hand. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between the billionaire on the bed and the machines keeping him alive. He wasn't used to being in places like this, surrounded by polished floors and expensive equipment. He felt out of place, as if he didn't belong. But when Howard's eyes met his, everything else faded into the background. You saved me?" Howard's voice cracked, the words sounding almost impossible for him to say. Marcus hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I couldn't just leave you there." The room went silent for a moment, the words hanging in the air heavier than anything else. Howard stared at the boy in disbelief. He had lived his entire life thinking people like Marcus were beneath him. He had made cruel jokes, signed policies that harmed communities, and refused to acknowledge their struggles. And now, staring into the eyes of the boy who had dragged him out of a fiery death, he saw something he had never expected. Kindness. Howard's lips trembled. Why would you help me?" Marcus's mother squeezed his shoulder, but Marcus answered on his own. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the kind of truth that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. "Because it was the right thing to do. My mom always says you don't let hate change who you are." The words hit Howard like a sledgehammer. His eyes stung, and he had to blink away the tears that threatened to fall. He wasn't a man who cried. He wasn't a man who admitted weakness. But in that moment, his carefully built armor cracked wide open. He looked at Marcus, this small boy who had risked everything, and for the first time in decades he felt shame. The doctor cleared his throat. breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Kingston, you need rest. The boy has been waiting all night to know you were okay. Maybe you should thank him and let him go home." But Howard shook his head stubbornly. "No, he stays. I owe him that much." The nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do with the billionaire's intense gaze locked on him. He wasn't looking at Howard Kingston, the tycoon, the mogul, the man with private jets and skyscrapers. To Marcus, he was just a man who had almost died, and who now seemed smaller than he had ever appeared on TV. Howard struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Marcus," he said slowly, rolling the boy's name across his tongue as if trying to memorize it. "I've spent my life wrong about a lot of things. But you—" His voice broke and he swallowed hard before finishing. "You showed me more courage than I've ever shown anyone." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He simply shrugged, his voice calm, almost too simple for the weight of the moment. "I just did what anyone should do." But Howard knew better. He knew most people wouldn't have done what Marcus had, not in the face of fire, not for a man who had given them every reason not to care. As Marcus left the room with his mother, Howard leaned back against the pillows, his heart pounding with thoughts he couldn't shake. For the first time in his life, he saw the world not through his own arrogance, but through the eyes of a boy who had every reason to turn away and didn't. A boy who had saved his life, not because he deserved it, but because it was right, and that realization haunted him in the best way possible. The days after the crash passed in a blur of flashing cameras, breaking news headlines, and endless conversations. What had started as a terrifying accident had now turned into a story that captivated the entire city, and soon the entire country. News stations replayed the footage of the burning limousine, showing images of firefighters battling the flames. Reporters repeated the same unbelievable detail again and again. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus had saved billionaire Howard Kingston's life. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The world knew Howard for his wealth, his power, and his controversial views. The world knew Marcus as a child from a modest neighborhood, with no riches, no influence, just a bike and a heart full of courage. The headlines practically wrote themselves. "Young black boy saves billionaire. The rescue no one saw coming. Kindness defeats hate." Within hours, social media was flooded with Marcus's picture. His small frame standing next to the ambulance, his face streaked with ash and sweat. People called him a hero. Strangers sent messages of admiration. But the story didn't just spread because of what Marcus had done. It spread because of who he had saved. Howard Kingston wasn't just any man. He was a man who for years had built a reputation on arrogance and prejudice. People couldn't stop talking about the irony of it all. While the world debated, Howard lay in his hospital bed, wrestling with the heaviest thoughts of his life. He had lived surrounded by walls of pride, convinced of his own superiority. He had insulted communities without a second thought, made decisions that harmed the very people who now looked at Marcus as a symbol of hope. And the boy who represented everything Howard had once dismissed had been the one to drag him out of the fire. It gnawed at him day and night until he could no longer ignore the truth. A week later, when Howard was finally well enough to leave the hospital, he made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of disappearing quietly into the shadows, he called for a press conference. The moment was electric. The media swarmed the front of the hospital, cameras clicking, microphones pointed. The crowd buzzing with anticipation. Everyone expected him to make a statement about the accident, perhaps thank his doctors, maybe even acknowledge Marcus in passing. No one expected what actually happened. Howard Kingston walked slowly to the podium, his injuries still visible, his arm in a sling, a bandage across his forehead. But standing beside him was Marcus, dressed in his Sunday best, his mother's protective hand resting on his shoulder. The boy looked small compared to the towering figure of the billionaire, but the pride in his eyes made him stand tall. The flashing lights of cameras almost blinded them, but Howard never looked away from the sea of reporters. He gripped the microphone with his good hand, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "I have spent my life thinking I knew everything," he said, his voice raw and unsteady. "I thought money and power made me important. I thought my opinions, my judgments, my arrogance were the truth. And because of that, I let hate poison me. I let it define how I saw the world. And it was wrong. I was wrong, the crowd gasped. This was not the Howard Kingston they knew. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously, cameras zooming closer. Howard turned and looked down at Marcus, then back at the audience. When I was trapped in that car, seconds away from death, it wasn't my wealth or my power that saved me. It wasn't my business partners or my friends. It was him. A boy I had never met. A boy I once would have dismissed, judged, or ignored. He risked his life for mine, even though I had given him no reason to. That act of courage, that act of kindness, has changed me. His voice cracked, and for a moment he had to pause, gripping the podium tightly. I cannot undo the harm I've caused in the past. I cannot erase the words I've spoken or the decisions I've made. But what I can do is change what I do from this moment forward. And I intend to. Starting today, I am pledging to dedicate my resources, my wealth, and my influence to help the very communities I once overlooked. I am creating a scholarship fund in Marcus's name to give children like him the chance to dream bigger, to reach higher, to never feel limited by where they come from. The applause erupted instantly, but Howard wasn't done. This boy saved my life, but in more ways than one, he also saved my soul. I want the world to know that hate does not have the final word. Kindness does. Courage does. Marcus does. The room exploded with cheers, flashes of light, and shouts of questions. Marcus's mother held back tears as she hugged her son, and Marcus himself shifted shyly, not fully understanding the magnitude of what had just been promised in his name. All he knew was that something had shifted. The man beside him wasn't the same cold billionaire the world once knew. Something in him had cracked open, and through that crack, light had finally poured in. And from that moment, the story was no longer just about a boy saving a man from a burning car. It was about the way that act had set off a chain reaction, one that would ripple through boardrooms, schools, neighborhoods, and hearts for years to come. From the day of that press conference, nothing was ever the same. The story spread across television screens, social media feeds, and newspaper headlines around the world. People who had once cursed Howard Kingston's name now couldn't believe what they were seeing. A man who had built his entire life on arrogance and hate was standing beside the very boy he might have once dismissed, admitting his faults and vowing to do better. Some doubted him at first. They thought it was all a publicity stunt, just another billionaire trying to clean up his image. But as weeks turned into months, Howard proved them wrong. He didn't just donate money and disappear. He showed up. He visited schools in neighborhoods he had once ignored, sitting in classrooms and listening to children's dreams. He met with community leaders he had never given the time of day to, asking them what resources they needed and how he could help. He invested in programs that built libraries, playgrounds, and scholarships. And at every single event, he invited Marcus to stand beside him, not as a token, but as the reason he had changed. For Marcus, life transformed in ways he had never imagined. He wasn't just a boy riding his bike through the wealthy neighborhoods anymore. He was a hero whose name carried weight. His face was known across the country, his story told in classrooms and churches as an example of courage and kindness. Reporters asked for interviews, magazines wanted his picture, and people sent letters calling him an inspiration. But Marcus never let it get to his head. Whenever someone asked him how he felt about saving a billionaire and changing his life, his answer was always simple. I just did what anyone should do. Help someone in need. Yet beneath his humility, Marcus began to understand something deeper. He realized that his choice that day, to run toward danger instead of away from it, had not only saved a man's life, but it also created a ripple effect. Because of his actions, millions of dollars were being poured into schools and communities. Because of his bravery, conversations about prejudice and kindness were happening in boardrooms and dinner tables across the country. His single act of courage had started a movement, and though he didn't plan it, he was at the center of it. Howard, too, was changing in ways people didn't expect. The once cold, calculating businessman was now a man who smiled more, who listened more, who made time for children who reminded him of Marcus. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. He invited Marcus to his home, not as a guest but as family. They would sit together for hours. Marcus asking questions about business, Howard answering patiently, often humbled by the boy's curiosity. Slowly, the walls between them disappeared. What began as a debt of gratitude grew into something much greater. Friendship. There were challenges, of course. Not everyone believed in Howard's transformation. Some critics insisted people like him never truly change. Others argued he was only doing it to protect his reputation. But every time doubt arose, Howard simply pointed to Marcus and said, "If a boy this young could risk everything to save a man like me, then I have no excuse not to risk everything to be better." The most powerful moment came a year after the accident, when the first group of students received scholarships from the Marcus Carter Foundation. Named in honor of the boy who had saved Howard's life, dozens of children stood on stage, holding certificates, their families cheering with tears streaming down their faces. Marcus, standing in the front row, couldn't stop smiling. He didn't care about the cameras or the applause. He cared about the kids whose lives were about to change. Just like his had, Howard took the microphone that day and said, "Marcus taught me something no amount of money ever could. Hate divides, but kindness heals. Prejudice blinds, but courage opens eyes. And sometimes it takes the smallest voice to teach the loudest lesson." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus just looked up at Howard and gave a shy grin. In the years that followed, Marcus continued to grow, his life shaped by the accident and everything that came after. He still rode his bike, still hung out with his friends, still lived in the same neighborhood. But now, when he rode through the wealthy streets, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like someone who had built a bridge between two worlds, and that was the true miracle of the story. Marcus hadn't just saved a billionaire from a burning car. He had saved a man from himself. He had saved a heart from hate. He had reminded the world that compassion has the power to break down even the strongest walls of prejudice. In the end, the lesson was simple but unforgettable. Hate may be loud, but kindness is louder. Marcus proved that you don't need money, power, or fame to make a difference. You just need the courage to do what's right. And because of that courage, a boy with nothing gave the world something priceless: hope.